Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 176, and I am the show's host, Kyle. On this episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I'm going to be discussing the protests that were going on in Gaza on Friday. The Israeli government ended up attacking the protesters and things got bloody and deadly, so I'm going to break that down, give some analysis, what it's all about. One of the things I'm going to talk about is that you're not going to get this kind of coverage in the mainstream media. They attempt to block and suppress and confuse this story. And so for those of you who want others to understand, what's really going on here, please think about sharing the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. Okay, so the protest happened on Friday, March 27th, Passover for the Jewish people, Good Friday for the Christians, and for the people of Gaza, this was a planned protest, as I believe some were calling it the right of return protest, some people were calling it a march of return or a land day protest. The date of this protest was picked because it's significant in that the Palestinians were removed from a lot of their land on this day and, are now living in somewhat of a refugee camp in Gaza. For those of you who have the ability to take the time to look at a map, you might want to do so real quick just to peek at where Gaza is. Gaza is in the southwest corner of Israel. It borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west, a little bit of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, and then shares a large border with Israel. It's really complicated to explain exactly what Gaza is in international terms, and I think that is intentionally kept this way. Gaza is kind of a part of Israel, but not really. In some ways, I think people are kind of proposing that a solution would be for Gaza to be absorbed by Egypt and just become a part of the Sinai Peninsula. But in a lot of ways, the people there are in somewhat of a refugee camp and somewhat of a prison. The border of Gaza, the land border, is surrounded by a fence on all sides, and then in the Mediterranean Sea, Israel blockades it, I think only allowing fishermen to go a mile or two off the coast of Gaza. And so the Gazans are really isolated from the rest of the world. The border crossings with the Israelis are often hard to pass if it's ever possible at all. Since 2013, when I think Al-Sisi took control in Egypt, which reminds me, I could throw this in here. Al-Sisi just won another 4-year term as Egypt's president. Of course, this is, one of those things where a lot of people make a big deal out of the elections in Russia and point out how Putin imprisoned some of his competitors and, it definitely wasn't what you would call a free and fair election. It seems that Putin is somewhat popular in Russia, but he does suppress his political opposition. However, Al-Sisi actually imprisoned most of his opposition and won 97% of the vote with only 41% voter turnout. And so, it's interesting how none of this election really gets questioned and people are just like, oh, Al-Sisi won another term and that's what it is. Where when Putin wins another term, it's rigged and he's this evil tyrant dictator kind of thing. But back to that story, the border crossing between Gaza and Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula has often remained closed. The last time it was supposed to open, it only opened for a few hours, and that's because it was that data, I believe ISIS ended up being at least claimed responsibility for the attack on the Sufis in the Sinai Peninsula. I think like 200 people had died when they, opened machine gun fire on a mosque there, and it was a huge and just awful tragedy. But very interestingly, the Egyptians took this opportunity to then keep that border crossing closed. Last Friday, Egypt did offer and allowed that border crossing to stay open for a couple days, which I'm assuming allowed a lot of necessary, commercial goods even to get in that country so people could buy and consume and have things. But now we could get back to the day of the protest. 3,500 protesters turn out. I think there's about 2 million total people that live in Gaza between, I guess 1.8 is the number I see from some people, and some people I see say 2 million. So I don't know if others are rounding or one's more accurate or whatever, but about that many people live there. Those protesters rallied to a point that was, some distance, I don't know, quarter mile, half mile away from the fence where the Israelis were on the other side. The Israelis knew about this protest, so they sent 100 additional snipers there. The Israelis had tanks. They have, at some of the border crossings, they even have mechanical guns that are kind of operated in drone fashion by a base a couple miles down the road. And so this border is well protected and well armed. And again, I don't know if border is necessarily the correct term for it. I mean, it may just be, the gates of the prison, maybe a little bit more correct, but for whatever it is, I'll just say border here. Border fence makes sense. The protesters then start to march towards the border fence, but still were a good distance away from it. Some protesters got closer and began throwing rocks at the Israeli military, and others rolled tires. Some were on fire towards the border fence. There's also reports that the Gazans, or Hamas, which is the ruling faction within Gaza, attempted to use 2 or 3 explosive devices or fire bombs, but I haven't seen any video, and I did watch a lot of video of these protests to try to get a real feel of what was going on here. And so I didn't see any video. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it is very clear that the border fence is never breached whatsoever throughout these protests. And so it seems unlikely that any kind of explosive device was, used and planted and attempted to explode the fence. We now know that the Israeli military said that anybody that came within 100 meters of the Gazan side of the border fence, so this doesn't mean that you get 100 meters past the border, but that you get 100 meters within it, so still within Gaza, then the Israeli snipers had permission to open fire on those coming that close. So when the protesters did get that close, the Israeli military opened fire. Over 750 injured, at least 615 with bullet injuries, and then at least 18 killed so far, but there's others who are still fighting for their lives. The Israeli army used tear gas, live rounds, and rubber-coated steel bullets. The tear gas that the Israelis use is pretty serious and pretty effective. On a documentary that I talked about the last time I talked about Israel, and that was, I forget the number of the episode, but it's the heroism of Ahed Tamimi. And of course, her and her family live in the West Bank, which is a different occupied area of Palestine. But in that episode, I talk about a documentary put together by Veterans for Peace, where they go and attend protests where the Israeli army shows up and then uses tear gas. And there's several military veterans, Matthew Ho and Chris Smiley, attending the event, and they say this is pretty serious tear gas that the Israelis are using here. And then the rubber-coated steel bullets, a lot of people, kind of picture this as like a beanbag guns type of situation, but it's really not. The rubber-coated steel bullets break bones. They, cause people to go blind. They could cause internal bleeding if you're shot in the stomach or abdomen. And in fact, Ahed Tamimi's cousin has lost a quarter of his skull after being shot in the face by one of these rounds. Of the 18 people so far killed, at least a couple of those people were shot in the back as they were moving away from the border. One man you could see clearly on video, and I will link to that video in the show notes page, running away from the border, estimated I think over 200 meters away from the border, and shot in the back. So, and then of the people who are injured and not killed, the 615 who had gunshot injuries, a lot of those were to the ankle. Later, we saw a report, and then somebody in the Israeli government posted that what the Israeli military was doing with the shots that they were taking were intentional, and they seemed to target people who were previously throwing rocks or shooting people in the ankle. And so, these are really serious. These are civilians. These are people protesting here. To call them a threat in any way to Israel seems absurd. They never got within 100 meters or so of the, border fence. Those that did were individuals and were mostly, I guess, trying to push tires that were on fire towards the border fence. I couldn't figure out, if this was just some kind of protest thing or maybe a tactical move on the part of the Gazans. I mean, these people have no protection whatsoever and are staring down an army with tanks and snipers and automatic weapons. I mean, if the Israelis wanted to, they could have very easily taken out this entire group of people. And they did take out, 600, 700 people nearly, with, the ammunition that they did use, and the others that were dispersed through the, very serious and powerful tear gas. But having the tires there could have provided maybe some cover, although it seemed to be a very windy day from the video. But anyways, the burning tire burns very black smoke, and maybe creating any kind of barrier between yourself and the sniper's vision could be helpful in, having you not get shot in this case. And then the throwing rocks thing. This is obviously ridiculous, right? That somebody is going to throw a rock at a tank, and then for anybody to in any way justify that validates shooting that person, especially if that person is on the other side of a fence. And sometimes libertarians make really stupid arguments and get really caught up in this whole non-aggression principle thing, and that, you could use force to combat somebody who's using force against you. But there's definitely a proportionality thing to it. If a toddler comes up and kicks me in the shin, I can't then kick that toddler in the face with my boot. That's obviously what I did there is murder. And if somebody throws a rock at a tank and then gets shot by that same military, that's murder. There's no other way to look at it, right? And I don't know. It just seems so ridiculous to me that you would have to use any kind of force against these people. I mean, the tear gas is the one that you could kind of say, well, the Israelis were legitimately just trying to disperse the crowds or something like that. I don't agree with using the tear gas against them, but at least in that case, it does make it look like you're only trying to keep them from getting to the border. But when you start opening fire on people who are running away from you, you're obviously trying to do more than that, and that's to send a message. To go a little bit into why this all happened, and I kind of brought this up in the beginning with the Palestinians really being blockaded and having lost their land to the Israelis and now more or less living in a refugee camp prison. But there are other issues here too. One of the things I mentioned was that some of the protests were labeled as the March of Return. And this is because there's an issue on the table called the right of return. The international community guarantees refugees that, if they're displaced by war, fighting, whatever, and you go to a refugee camp, eventually you will be, when the situation is safe, have the right to return to your own land that you had before. Now, obviously, there's a lot of problems and complexities to this. Meaning that, some of the Palestinians have lost their land over 70 years ago. And so the people who took their land are likely not the people that still own it. In any case where that is the case, where there's somebody, maybe an old Israeli soldier or something who's still sitting on land that he took from Palestinians, then yeah, they should be able to go and get that back tomorrow, because that's pretty clear cut and simple, right? Like, that was just stolen from them. It gets more complicated if, maybe the property's passed down for a couple of generations, and now the people who own the house, maybe are even sympathetic towards the Palestinian cause or something like that. And so I'm not, saying that this is simple and clear cut. What I'm saying is the exact opposite. That's complex, and that, there's a lot to be worked out here. And then there's issues where the, land was maybe, sold to somebody else, and then there's more transactions, going on here. But that doesn't mean that there's, not a solution. And, the thing to point about, another thing to point out is that the faster that you would be able to bring attention and address this situation, the more justice would be able to be served. In the United States of America, we have this thing, this real kind of problem that, there's some people that were living here that were actually living here before, the most of the rest of us, either, Europeans or Asians or, people of Spanish or, South American descent who have then since come to America and now live here. But there were other people who lived here first and their land was taken from them unfairly. But yet, the place where I sit right now, I didn't take it from anybody. And so, it's a really kind of complicated thing to have to figure out. But the sooner that it's addressed, it's worth noting the more justice I think that, could be had. I want to talk briefly about Justin Raimondo article because this is kind of what prompted me to, think about this issue, where he points out that some of the Palestinian tactics, including this protest, don't seem to be super beneficial to the, Palestinian Gaza cause. I think I disagree with the overall conclusions of his article, but for anybody who wants a different take than mine on the overall protest. I recommend checking it out, and I'll link to it in the show notes page. Justin makes a lot of really good points in that article. Some I agree with, some I don't, but all made me think a lot more and a lot more deeply about this situation. A complicating factor that Raimondo points out is Hamas, and just that Hamas isn't a great group of people, and they're a pretty violent militia that is the political and military controlling faction within Gaza. And so, that does create some problems and issues for the Palestinians. And the other things I wanted to point out is just how miserable the living conditions are within Gaza. At some reports, the Gazans are limited to about 4 hours worth of power a day. And this isn't, necessarily a place like Alaska or anything where living with 4 hours worth of power a day is anything, near desirable. It must be miserable. One thing I think about, living in the first world war I do, that I absolutely couldn't live without if there was an apocalypse or anything like that, is air conditioning. Man, I would be in a foul mood from, June till August if I didn't have air conditioning. And so, these are the conditions that these people are now allowed to live in. While we subsidize an Israeli state that has universal health care and free college, people who live within the Palestinian state and under the occupation and military rule of the Israeli government don't even have access to power more than 4 hours a day. There's also a blockade of concrete from getting into Gaza, and this presents a real problem because there's been a war going on, and throughout the years Israel has bombed Gaza time and time again, and as you bomb places, the structures are destroyed, also just wear and tear, things get old and break down and crumble. And so it makes it really difficult for people in Gaza to rebuild. And also, it just must be hard living in a situation where, like I said, you're like in a refugee prison camp. You're hoping to one day return to your lands and to have some sort of normal life. But these people are in a camp. They're blocked in. It's not like they could go and travel other places whenever they want to. And they don't have a huge expansionist country like the United States of America. They're locked into this very tiny place. They're deprived of goods and resources and the ability to get medicine and medical care. Concrete, like I said, a lot of times even the Israeli border crossing or Egyptian border crossing is closed. And so one of the most interesting things about this event to me was the response by several different people. The Israelis, I found it very interesting that their response wasn't horrified at what their government had done, but they felt that it was justified and correct. And so this is a real problem. And Gordan Levy has written about this, and I'm going to link to his most recent article on this as well in the show notes page. Adam Johnson did a pretty good write-up, and Mehdi Hasan did another very good one on the coverage of this event in the Western media, specifically on the liberal side. You don't expect the Republicans or Fox News to ever say anything critical of Israel ever. But the left wing, these are supposed to be the humanitarian interventionists. Remember, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama used the responsibility to protect policy to say that we have to go into Libya to save the people of Benghazi from Muammar Gaddafi. And we end up killing and overthrowing a dictator and threw a country into complete chaos and insanity, and there's slavery and murder and rape running rampant in Libya. But yet when 18 Palestinians are murdered by the Israelis, that these people say nothing, and in fact often obscure the facts on the ground by saying that there were clashes within the protests, that there was a confrontation. And there wasn't clashes. There wasn't a confrontation. Clashes would imply that the Gazans had gotten through the fence and were rushing the Israelis, or trying to escape from the prison at the very least. But really, they were just protesting and were murdered. The response from the Gaza and Palestinian side, I think, has been a little bit of hoping that the message is getting out there. They got a lot of this stuff on video. You have this guy running away from the border and getting shot in the back. What a cowardly thing to do, to shoot an unarmed man in the back as he runs away from you. It's sick and awful thing to do. And then nobody is even pretending that there's going to be justice for the sniper. Nobody's asking, well, can we figure out who fired the round? Can we do ballistics here? Can we try to figure out who was responsible and hold this person accountable for committing a gruesome and just terrible act of murder? Shoot somebody fleeing unarmed from you in the back, who had no potential to hurt you in the first place. The thing I find interesting about this whole thing and the situation that the Gazans are in, and that they're, really not allowed to move out and just become a part of Israel in any way, are really locked and forced into this camp. And they weren't allowed to approach the border. It's not like, if the Israelis had let them into Israel, what would have happened? It kind of creates this conclusion in people, I think, that at least enough of the Palestinians are like rabid dogs, and if you let them loose in Israel, they're just going to run rampant over the people, and they'll blow themselves up, and they'll stab innocent Israeli Jews to death. And that's just the most ridiculous case to make. You're gonna punish, even if it was moderately true that you did have some people within Gaza who would go out and commit terror attacks within Israel, you're gonna punish a whole population of 2 million for that? That seems morally and just overall unjust and ridiculous. But the fact that if there is anybody within the refugee camp or the prison that hates you so much, that they're gonna, be willing to kill you, is probably not because, they have genetic flaws because they're Muslims or Palestinians, but it's because you treated them like dirt for their entire lives. I mean, the average population of the people in Gaza, I believe, is like 15 years old. So most of these people that are out there, and most of the people that died were in their 20s. They've lived this way their entire lives. And I think the point that this is most clear is we have a situation right now where there's, I think, a caravan of like 1,500 immigrants moving through Mexico towards the United States. Can you imagine the horror and the outrage if that as these people marched towards the United States government opened fire on them, injured 600, shot 600 of them, and then killed, 18, 20 or whatever? Well, first of all, they would be the biggest racists in the world, and everybody would point it out right away, right? That would be the main thing. Look at Trump's racist, terrible immigration policy where we have to shoot people to keep them out. Also, they would point out how morally unjust it is and how terrible it is that you're opening fire on unarmed people just looking to live a better life. But I think the biggest issue would just be, like, what are you saying by opening fire on them? How dangerous could these people possibly be that you're willing to murder innocent people to keep them out? The whole thing seems ridiculous, especially in the Israel case anyways, because they have all this tear gas that they're using that's pretty effective, and they have tanks and tons of armed soldiers. It's not like they couldn't have arrested the people if they did get through the fence, which they say that their goal wasn't to get through the fence anyways, that they were just out there protesting. And from, the actions from the majority of the people, that definitely seem to be the case. All right, so 2 more things I want to say before I wrap up the show. Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, said that he recognizes Israel's right to exist and looks forward to having a relationship with Israel in the future. I found it also interesting that he said that there was issues with the Israelis, and that being the mosque in Jerusalem and then the treatment of the Palestinians, and that he put the Palestinians second to the mosque. And I think that's kind of the direction that Saudi Arabia is moving, that they're willing to put the Palestinians aside to have a better relationship with Israel because for whatever reason they see Iran as the greatest threat. Mohammed bin Salman also called Iran the new Hitler of the Middle East. Oh, worse than Hitler of the Middle East, because they don't want to just take over Europe like Hitler did. The Iranians want to take over the entire planet. Last thing, Donald Trump, apparently during his conversation with Putin where he, called to congratulate him, also invited Putin to have a summit, potentially at the White House. So everybody, give Trump a pat on the back for that one. This is a great thing, right? This is the kind of thing that we were hoping and wanted to see from Trump. When a normal establishment kind of president, these policy wonk types, that would be like, meeting with Putin would be too validating to him, and we could never do something as complicated and silly as meet with Vladimir Putin. This is stupid and ridiculous and awful. And Donald Trump's like, yeah, I invite him. We're going to talk about arms control and see if we could rein this whole thing in. Because remember, people, these nuclear weapons, while they seem like, an impossible threat that they would never be used, in reality could wipe out the entire planet very quickly, within a couple of years of the war. Like, everybody could be dead, but billions within a couple of days of the start. And even if they're never used, the amount of, energy and time and human resources and capability, the amount of environmental destruction that happens, trying to create and maintain these weapons is really incalculable. I mean, the United States is planning to spend like $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years or so on nuclear weapons. Imagine if these nuclear scientists, rather than trying to develop new nuclear weapons, were just trying to develop more efficient nuclear energy. What that could do for the world, how much people's standards of living can increase, how much less poverty and homelessness, because food's able to get there on time and cheaper. If electricity is cheaper, you're able to build things cheaper. You could build more housing. Everything just gets so much cheaper and so much more efficient. If you stop wasting all the most brilliant people and all this money and time on the stupid nuclear weapons. And so anything that, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin could do, to, take the amount of nuclear weapons, and we're definitely going the wrong direction with them down, would be a huge positive. So despite all the other terrible things the guy does, willing to sit down with Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump should be, two big things, that Donald Trump is doing in the right direction. So wrap up the show there for today. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. I'm on MeWe now. You can find my group there is Foreign Policy Focus. I also have one for my brand new news website, immersionnews.com. All of you check that out. I promise you'll love it. If you want to donate to the show, help me to get more better equipment, stuff like that, I'm on Patreon, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, Twitter at KYAAALE. The show is on BitChute and YouTube under the channel name Immersion News.